Using music in your podcast might seem like a simple way to spice things up, but it can quickly turn into a legal nightmare. Now imagine this. You've got your podcast episode ready to go. The content is top-notch. You've added a great piece of music that really brings it all together. And then just as you're celebrating a successful production, you get hit with a cease and desist letter because the music wasn't properly licensed, or you get a takedown notice. It's a situation no podcaster wants to be in, but it's all too common. And today, we are going to dive deep into the legal challenges of using music in podcasts, why it's so complicated, and what you can do to protect yourself and welcome back to another episode of Legit Podcast Pro. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and if you're a content creator, this episode is must listen for you. We're talking about the legal issues surrounding music in your show. It's an area that can be surprisingly tricky, and getting it wrong can have serious consequences. So we're going to cover the biggest challenges you'll face when using music, and then we'll explore some practical solutions and best practices that'll help you navigate these kinds of issues as smoothly as possible. By the end of this episode, you'll have a clear understanding of how to use music legally and effectively in your podcast. So let's just jump right in. First, let's talk about copyright laws and licensing, which is where so many creators run into trouble. Whether you are dealing with music, whenever you're dealing with music, copyright law is really the foundation you need to understand. And in simple terms, what copyright does is protects the creator's exclusive rights in their work. This means that if someone writes, performs, or records a piece of music, they own the rights to it, and you can't just use it freely in your show. Here's where it gets complicated. There are different types of licenses that cover different aspects of music use. For instance, if you want to include a song in your podcast, you might need a synchronization license, which allows you to combine the lyrics and the musical components of the composition with your visual and audio content. But that's not all. You might also need a performance license if the music is broadcast or streamed, and a master use license if you are distributing copies of your podcast, and a mechanical license is possible too. The important thing is that when you're using the recording of a song, you're actually using the recording is a separate work from the composition. So you've got to deal with at least those two licenses. And understanding which licenses you need and how to obtain them really is crucial. It's not just about avoiding legal trouble. It's about respecting the rights of the creators whose work you want to use. So let's talk a little bit about one of the big hurdles, and that's the costs involved, because licensing music, especially very popular music, can be very expensive. If you've ever tried to license a well-known song, you might have been shocked by the price tag. Pop music is in high demand, and the expenses and fees will reflect that. So depending on the song and how you intend to use it, those fees could range from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of dollars, or even more. For independent podcasters, those costs can really be kind of prohibitive. And this is frustrating, especially when you find that perfect song that fits your content just perfectly and then discover it's way out of your budget. But there are some ways that you can manage these costs, and we'll get into this a little later. The key takeaway here is be aware of these potential expenses and plan accordingly, because licensing is an investment in the legal safety of your podcast, and it's important to budget for it from the very start. Now, another common issue, hurdle, trouble spot is confusion around this concept of fair use. Fair use is a legal doctrine that allows for limited use of copyrighted material without permission from the rights holders under certain circumstances, like criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. But it's a defense and not a right, and it has to be interpreted on a case-by-case basis. Lots of podcasters assume that using a short clip of music or using it in some kind of an educational context automatically qualifies as fair use, but that is definitely not always the case. Fair use involves considering factors like the purpose and character of the use, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the portion that's been taken in the infringing use, and the effect on the potential market for or value of the original work. The bottom line is that fair use is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Relying on it without fully understanding the risks can lead to legal trouble, so it's always better to seek a proper license or consult with a legal professional if you're not exactly sure about what's going on. Now, another challenge that podcasters often overlook is the complexity of dealing with the multiple rights holders. As I said before, when you use a piece of music, you might need to get permission from several different people or entities. The songwriter owns the composition, and the publisher administers the rights to use the composition, while the performer and the record label own the recording and might also have rights to the masters. So each of these parties has the power to grant or deny permission for their part of the music. And because we use something called 100% licensing here in the US, missing one of those rights holders could be fatal and cause you serious legal consequences. Now, the process can be quite time consuming and complicated, especially if you've got rights that are held by lots of different organizations or individuals. And sometimes you have heirs of children and grandchildren, so it gets scattered very far. It's a situation that requires a lot of planning and thorough communication. And if you're going to navigate this process yourself, make sure you really understand who owns what rights and how to contact them. Alternatively, consider using a music clearance service that might handle the negotiations for you, or hire a lawyer to help out. Now let's discuss the risks of using unlicensed music in your podcast. The consequences of using music without a proper license can be pretty severe. If you use unlicensed music, you could be facing DMCA takedowns, cease and desist letters, legal actions, financial penalties, and lawsuits. On top of that, your podcast could get taken down off the platforms if you have multiple strikes. Most of the platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, they'll give you 3 chances, and then you can lose your channels altogether. So that'll damage your reputation and reach, not to mention just being embarrassing. Now, these are not theoretical risks. They happen to podcasters with some frequency. The cost of a lawsuit or a settlement can be enormous. It could certainly outweigh the cost of properly licensing the music in the first place. And, the safest course of action is to ensure that every piece of music in your podcast is properly licensed, or that you have explicit permission from the rights holders, or be sure that it's fair use. Have an opinion from a lawyer or something. So now that we've covered all these challenges, let's talk a little bit about some solutions. One of the most straightforward options is just use royalty-free music. These are tracks that are available usually for a one-time fee or sometimes a subscription, and allow you to use them in your podcast without worrying about paying ongoing royalties. There are plenty of music libraries out there for this kind of music, and they offer a wide range of musical genres and styles, making it very easy to find something that fits your show. In fact, the opening music from our show, it's just a little tag, but it's there. We get that from Epidemic Sound, and I highly recommend Epidemic for one of these subscription music libraries. Another solution is to look into Creative Commons licensing. Some artists release their music under the Creative Commons license, which allows you to use their music for free as long as you follow the terms of the license, like giving appropriate credit and not using the music for commercial purposes. But watch out for what's called the share-alike license, because what that says is if you use some music from the Creative Commons under a share-alike license, you have to make your content available under that license as well and allow people to use it for free. That may be okay with you, or maybe it isn't. So working with an independent artist is also a great option. If you collaborate directly with a musician, a composer, songwriter, you could often negotiate much more affordable licensing terms, or even free, and get custom music created specifically for your show. That not only helps you stay on budget, but also supports these creators. And if the licensing process feels overwhelming to you, you could use a music clearance service. These services will handle all the legal details for you and ensure that you have all the necessary permissions in place. It can be a great way to simplify the process and make sure everything is done correctly, but it's not without costs because these services obviously charge fees. So now let's go over some best practices just to keep your podcast legally sound and avoid any issues that come up related to your use of music. First, as I've been saying, always secure the necessary licenses before you put music into your podcast. Don't assume that just because a piece of music is available and accessible, that it's free to use. Do your due diligence and make sure you're covered. Secondly, budget for music licensing early in the production process. It's very important to account for these costs up front so you're not caught off guard later on. Think of licensing as an investment in your podcast's long-term success and legal safety. Third, avoid relying on fair use as your primary strategy for music use. While fair use can be a valid defense in some cases, it is not something you should count on without fully understanding its limitations and the specific circumstances of your case. And you need to go through that 4-factor analysis, that balancing test for each episode to make sure that what you're doing is going to fly. Now, finally, consider consulting a lawyer or using legal templates to ensure full compliance with the music licensing laws. Having a solid legal foundation will save you from a lot of headaches down the road. So to sum up, using music in your podcast doesn't have to be a legal minefield, but it does require careful planning and attention to detail. By understanding the challenges, exploring the available solutions, and following best practices, you can protect your podcast and keep it running smoothly. So thanks for tuning into this episode of Legit Podcast Pro. If you want to make sure your podcast is legally sound, please check out the Easy Legal Forms and Templates store for podcasters over at podcastlawforms.com, where you'll find sample music contracts, composer deals, licenses, and much more that'll help you navigate the legal aspects of podcasting with confidence and security. And until next time, keep on creating and keep on doing it the legal way.